Hi everyone, it's Rand here. Welcome to my room. It's late on Thursday. Believe it or not, I've been facing my camera for the last 10 minutes, not being quite sure what I was going to talk about. I had various ideas, but I was kind of feeling, okay, yeah, I don't want to talk about that, I'm not sure. I kind of want to answer someone's suggestion, make a video about a suggestion, because I consulted the audience not so long ago, and there are some suggestions that I wanted to tackle. But of course, it also depends on the mood of the day, and took me a while to decide. This video is not supposed to be about my indecision, which actually I think I just gave myself an idea. How great is that? It's rare when I give myself ideas live in this kind of improvising fashion. Make a video on the relationship between let's say being an INFJ and indecision. Because we're more likely to imagine that P-types are indecisive, but I have a strong relationship with a certain kind of indecision and I want to tackle it, so I'll bookmark it inside my brain. In the meantime, though, we're going to talk about fantasy worlds. We Got One Love, I hope that's how you pronounce your name, has listed a number of suggestions. There's quite a few of them, and a lot of those suggestions are quite interesting and pertinent. But I'm just going to start with fantasy worlds because that's my pick. Thank you, by the way, for being a very committed and faithful follower. So fantasy worlds and INFJ, this on paper it's an easy and ideal topic to discuss. Once you approach a little bit closer to the topic itself and the theme itself, it turns out to be not so easy to dissect, for the simple reason that it's not so obvious how an INFP's or an ENFP's fantasy world or an INTP's fantasy world is different from an INFJ's fantasy world. I think there must be differences. I think that a fantasy world that is driven by NI and FE accompanying it is going to be qualitatively distinct from, let's say, a fantasy world which is driven by NE with FI accompanying it, as in the case of an INFP or an ENFP. And then the hierarchy of the functions is going to be of importance there. Not least because often I find that fantasy is close to dreaming, and there is a lot of fantasy enacted in our dreams. And it would be assumed, I think, most likely rightly, that the closest you are to being unconscious and to unconsciously engage and revel in fantasies, the closest you are to be driven by your main functions in a kind of straightforward hierarchical way. So NI dominance and FE auxiliary in the case of an INFJ, or TI dominance, NE auxiliary in the case of an INTP, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's probably likely that fantasy worlds are different depending on the type that you are. That there is a qualitative difference, and maybe there is something that unifies the ways, not necessarily the content and the substance of each INFJ's fantasy world. I'm pretty sure that my fantasy world is unique to me, but maybe the way in which we relate to it, and maybe some cross-cutting themes or cross-cutting parameters are to be found. What I can say is that I have a very vivid I have a very vivid imagination, and I have a very vivid fantasy world at my disposal that I can go to. And this has been the case ever since I was young, ever since I am as young as I can remember, really. I can give you some examples. What I find to be distinctive of my fantasy worlds, and addictive by the same token about them, is that they can be so vivid that they can give me a pleasure. I'm not going to say it's completely akin to the pleasure that I would have gotten had this fantasy been realized, or not gotten, by the way, because sometimes when something of this kind gets realized, you realize it's not that pleasurable. But still, a purveyor of such contentment, or rather enjoyment, entertainment, and pleasure, that I could often get wrapped up in them. And I think a lot of the time, my creative writing, which has not been philosophical, has been geared towards trying to recreate some of that, and unfortunately, it's extremely hard to capture in writing the experience of a fantasy world that you can have in your imagination. Very vivid, distinctively vivid, and addictively vivid. I remember even, what's interesting too is that there's a lot of things about my life and my younger life that I've forgotten. A lot of facts, a lot of names. But those fantasy worlds, those projections, those reveries, those things that I imagined, a lot of them were kind of ridiculous. You wouldn't want to confess them. I remember many of them. I'm not saying that I remember them all, but I remember many of them dating back to like when I was a young kid. Like I'm saying, maybe 7 or 8. I was definitely in high school. I was definitely in primary school, and I liked this girl. As a boy, and I liked this girl. Probably liked many girls, but there's this particular one I remember. In fact, I have fantasy worlds associated with other girls. Now, of course, these were the imaginative projections of a young kid. But I can remember how I would just imagine that like she would show up at my house and play with me for a while, and then tell me that she loved me. And I know exactly who this person is. She lives somewhere in France, I'm sure. I don't think she wants to know that, by the way. She'd be like, this guy is crazy, because that's from like 24 years ago or something. And so I'd have like these moments, and really I'd get so moved, so happy about this vision of a kind of desire of mine just getting fulfilled. That applied to obviously loves, and that until quite late into my teens. I think these days maybe I don't have that quite as much. Obviously I still have it, maybe not quite as much. There's an element of my fantasy world that is about also, and I think maybe this has to do more with Effie, the association between Ni and Effie. What I would say is my fantasy worlds are not necessarily all over the place. There are some distinct themes and distinct things that happen. There's definitely one that tends to recur, and it is the fact of, and it's obviously, well, it was more common when I was younger, but it has to do with like somehow becoming famous as a result of, I used to have many fantasies about like being a musician and a great guitar player, or becoming a famous writer and getting the recognition. So this could be an element of Effie there involved. Getting the sort of pleasure or satisfaction of being recognized for my art, always an art that I practiced with a certain amount of virtuosity or passion, something that is the very stuff of fantasy. But again, not only when I dream, sometimes I just daydream about something like that. Sometimes about being super helpful to other people and being very dependable, but like to an extent that I'd be like almost a saint, but with a degree of vividness that not only would I sometimes experience intense pleasure, but sometimes when the fantasies involved something moving, something that either I brought about or other people that I was witnessing in my daydreams, my dreams, brought about, and in which I was somehow involved, I would cry. I'd cry during the day. That's how vivid it is, and my parents, I have to say, were a bit worried about that. Because, for example, and this is why I'm suggesting that maybe there's a difference between types. I don't know if I can extrapolate to the extent that there is a difference between types just from this particular instance, but my brother, who's INFP, and his imagination is, in some respects, more diverse, I think, and more immediate than mine. Well, I don't know if that's true. But he's able to kind of convey a world of like associations and imagination that is just really spontaneous and funny and impressive to me anyway, and inspiring. But I don't think that he has, and he's extremely sensitive, but he has not had these extreme emotional reactions to just mere thoughts, mere projections of a fantasy world that I've had. I've never seen that, and I think it's not just because he's hiding it. I think that's because he doesn't have it to the same extent, this physical reaction, if you like. So it can be happiness, contentment, pleasure of some sort. It can be sadness, or maybe not sadness, but emotional elation that translates into crying. But it can also be sometimes things like shame that I experience even by the mere fact of picturing it very violently. There's something that you could argue is disabling about having such a vivid imagination and capacity for projection. When you feel things that strongly, is that you can feel them, and if they're good, they're good. If they're not good, well, that can put you in a mood, and maybe that's not something that you want your mere imagination to bring about, but that's definitely something. And also, sometimes just picturing something, being on the bus and picturing something like a funny situation involving my brother or involving a friend, or usually a funny person and me, and doing something silly, completely imagined, completely hypothetical. And I'd start laughing by myself on the bus, and people would be looking at me and be like, is this guy okay? And because I'm an heavy user and I'm like very socially aware in other respects, I'd be like, well, too late. I just gave away that I am crazy now. So that's my life. That's my life. And if there's one thing that I've learned in addition to that, it's that I think having this fantasy world should not be neutered or negated or even weakened by getting older. Perhaps to a certain extent there is an inevitability of one's relationship to one's fantasies, and I'm using fantasies in a very broad term, as you understand. There's probably an inevitable influence of age and aging. Maybe not in terms of negating the fantasies, but changing their nature. But I think that the more, it's what I've realized with my little bit of experience, is that the more they remain with you, the more it indicates that you are well, that you are happy in life, that you're not subjected to life, but you're living life. And this has been very informative for me. For example, in a work environment, so maybe I think I'll make a video on being an INFJ in the workplace, because I felt there was a streamlining effect where I came across as just like kind of zany in the view of other people when I was kind of living these fantasies and sometimes even talking about them. And there was the sense, and again, FE I think plays a role, the sense of me feeling pressure to be more like how I perceived others and trying to repress those fantasies, those projections, living this kind of permanent dream in a way that's mixed with life in a strange organic sense. But when that happened, I became unhappier. And sometimes I only realized that months later. Keep your fantasy worlds, keep your fantasies, keep them vibrant, keep them vivid, live with them and never be ashamed of them. And even if sometimes you lose yourself in them for a little too long, what's going to happen? It's a sign, I think, I'm almost convinced of it at this point, of health and happiness for an INFJ. But let me know what you think in the comments, guys, and I will see you soon. Ciao.